The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth as Dan McCready stumbled through the endless mesquite and cactus, his cracked lips moving in silent prayer for water that seemed as distant as salvation itself. The 34-year-old drifter had been walking for 3 days since his horse had collapsed and died from exhaustion, leaving him stranded in some of the most unforgiving country in the Southwest. His last meal had been 2 days ago, a scrawny rabbit he'd managed to snare and cook over a pitiful fire of dried grass and twigs. Dan's clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, evidence of weeks of near starvation that had preceded this latest catastrophe. He'd lost his ranch 6 months ago to a combination of drought, cattle disease, and creditors who showed no mercy for a man's misfortune. Since then, he'd been wandering from town to town, picking up odd jobs when he could find them, sleeping rough when he couldn't afford a bed, and slowly learning what it meant to exist on the very margins of survival. His canteen had been empty since yesterday morning, and the desert heat was beginning to play tricks with his mind. Mirages shimmered in the distance, promising water that dissolved into nothingness as he approached. The vultures that had been circling overhead for the past hour seemed to be growing more patient, as if they sensed their time was coming soon. As Dan crested a small rise crowned with beryl cactus and ocotillo, he spotted something that made him question his sanity. In the meager shade of a stunted oak tree, perhaps 50 yards ahead, sat a small figure that appeared to be a child. The figure wasn't moving, and Dan's heart clenched with the terrible possibility that he'd found another victim of the desert's indifferent cruelty. Summoning strength he didn't know he possessed, Dan half ran, half stumbled down the slope toward the motionless form. As he drew closer, he could see it was indeed a child, an Apache boy of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, unconscious and barely breathing in the pitiful shade. The boy's traditional clothing was torn and sun-faded, his lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and his small chest rose and fell with the shallow, irregular rhythm of someone very close to death. Dan dropped to his knees beside the child, his own desperate thirst momentarily forgotten in the face of this greater emergency. The boy's skin was burning with fever, and Dan could see that he'd been lost in the desert for at least as long as Dan himself, possibly longer. Without water, without food, without shelter, neither of them would survive another day in this hellish landscape. But as Dan looked down at the unconscious child, something stirred in his chest that had nothing to do with his own survival. He still had a few drops of water left in his canteen, not enough to save his own life, but perhaps enough to give this boy a fighting chance. The decision took less than a heartbeat to make. Carefully lifting the boy's head, Dan poured the last precious drops of water between the cracked lips, watching as the child's throat worked instinctively to swallow. The boy's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark and unfocused, before closing again, but his breathing seemed to strengthen slightly, and Dan felt a surge of hope that defied all logic and circumstance. With the Apache boy still unconscious in his arms, Dan faced the grim reality that they were both going to die unless he could find water within the next few hours. The child was lighter than he should have been, his small body wasted by hunger and dehydration, but carrying him would drain what little strength Dan had left. Still, the thought of leaving the boy to die alone was unbearable. If Dan was going to perish in this desert, at least he'd do so knowing he'd tried to save an innocent life. Dan had learned a few things about desert survival during his years ranching in this harsh country. Water followed certain patterns, even in the driest landscapes. Animals created trails to hidden springs, certain plants indicated underground moisture, and experienced eyes could read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. Scanning the horizon with desperate intensity, Dan spotted a line of green vegetation winding through a distant canyon, cottonwoods and willows that could only survive near permanent water. The journey to the canyon took 4 agonizing hours, with Dan stopping frequently to rest and check on the boy's condition. Twice he thought the child had died, only to feel the faint flutter of breath against his cheek. The sun was merciless, and Dan's vision began to blur with heat exhaustion, but the promise of water kept him moving forward with mechanical determination. When they finally reached the canyon floor, Dan nearly wept with relief at the sight of a small spring bubbling from beneath a cluster of boulders. The water was clear and cold, emerging from deep underground sources that had sustained life in this desert for thousands of years. Dan immediately immersed the boy's head and shoulders in the pool, letting the cooling water revive him while carefully dripping liquid between his lips. The Apache child's recovery was almost miraculous to witness. Within minutes of receiving water, his eyes opened and focused, revealing an intelligence and awareness that had been masked by his near-death condition. He drank greedily but carefully, his small hands shaking as he cupped water to his mouth. When he'd finally satisfied his immediate thirst, he looked up at Dan, with an expression of profound gratitude that transcended language barriers. "She? Who?" the boy asked in halting English, his voice barely a whisper. "Dan," the cowboy replied, offering his name simply. "Dan McCready. You're safe now, son." The boy nodded solemnly, then spoke a single word in Apache that Dan didn't understand but somehow knew was his name. "Takoda," the child repeated, pointing to himself. Then, with effort that obviously cost him greatly, he added in English, "Means, friend to everyone." Over the next hour, as they both recovered strength beside the life-saving spring, Dan learned fragments of Takoda's story. The boy had been separated from his family during a cavalry attack on their camp 2 weeks ago. He'd been hiding in the rocks when soldiers drove his people away, and by the time it was safe to emerge, everyone was gone. He'd been wandering the desert ever since, searching for any trace of his band while slowly starving and dying of thirst. "Family gone," Takoda said sadly, his dark eyes reflecting a sorrow far too deep for his young years. "Maybe dead, maybe far away. I lost, I alone." Dan felt his heart break for this brave child who'd survived 2 weeks alone in country that killed grown men in a matter of days. Despite his own desperate circumstances, he found himself thinking not about his own survival but about what he could do to help Takoda find his people. The spring provided water but no food, and both Dan and Takoda were weak from prolonged hunger. Dan had eaten nothing substantial in 3 days, while Takoda showed signs of severe malnutrition that suggested weeks of inadequate nutrition. They needed protein and calories urgently, but the desert around their oasis seemed as barren of game as it was of mercy. Dan had lost his rifle when his horse died, carrying only a worn Colt revolver with 6 precious cartridges. Ammunition was too valuable to waste on questionable shots, but their situation was becoming desperate enough to justify taking risks. As evening approached, Dan spotted movement near the spring, a small herd of javelinas coming to drink in the cooler air of dusk. The shot was difficult, taken at maximum range for a handgun, but desperation steadied Dan's aim. The bullet took down a young pig cleanly, providing them with meat that could sustain them for several days if carefully rationed. Takoda watched with obvious admiration as Dan field-dressed the animal and prepared it for cooking, using techniques the boy had never seen before. "You good hunter," Takoda observed as Dan built a small fire using dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. "Apache way is different, but you understand desert." "Had to learn," Dan replied, turning the meat on improvised spits. "This country doesn't forgive ignorance." As they shared their first real meal in days, Dan found himself studying the boy's face in the firelight. Takoda possessed an inner strength that seemed remarkable for his age, a quiet dignity that spoke of a culture that raised its children to face hardship with courage and grace. The boy ate slowly and deliberately, savoring each bite while obviously fighting the urge to consume everything at once. "Tell me about your family," Dan said gently. "What were they like?" Takoda's expression grew soft with memory and pain. "Father was horse trainer, best with wild mustangs, could make them gentle like dogs. Mother knew all plants which heal, which feed, which make strong medicine. Little sister was learning to bead like grandmother. You have any idea which direction they might have gone? Any sacred places or seasonal camps they might head for?" The boy considered this carefully, his young mind working through possibilities with surprising analytical skill. Father spoke of winter camp in mountains north, sacred caves where our ancestors lived long ago. If they escape soldiers, maybe go there. Dan studied the terrain visible in the moonlight, mentally calculating distances and survival requirements. The mountains Takoda described were at least a week's hard travel through country that would be actively patrolled by cavalry looking for escaped Apache. 2 people on foot, one of them a child, would have little chance of making such a journey undetected. "It's dangerous country between here and there," Dan said honestly. "Soldiers, hostile settlers, other Apache bands that might not be friendly. Maybe we should head for the nearest town instead, see if we can find information about where your people were taken." Takoda shook his head firmly. "No town. Town mean reservation, mean prison for Apache. Better to die free than live in cage." Dan understood that sentiment all too well. His own losses had taught him the value of freedom and the soul-crushing weight of having choices taken away by forces beyond one's control. Looking at this brave child who'd rather risk death than surrender his liberty, Dan made a decision that would change both their lives. "Then we head for the mountains," he said simply. "Tomorrow we start looking for your family." The journey north proved to be a test of endurance and ingenuity that pushed both Dan and Takoda to their limits. They traveled primarily at night to avoid the brutal heat and reduce the chance of being spotted by patrols, hiding during the day in whatever shade they could find among the rocks and sparse vegetation. Dan's knowledge of the country proved invaluable, while Takoda's Apache skills in reading sign and finding water kept them alive when the landscape seemed to offer nothing but death. On their third night of travel, they encountered the first real danger of their journey. A cavalry patrol had made camp near the only reliable water source for miles around, forcing Dan and Takoda to wait in hiding until the soldiers moved on. The delay cost them precious time and water, but it also provided valuable intelligence about military movements in the area. "Many soldiers," Takoda whispered as they watched the patrol prepare to depart. "More than usual. Something big happening." Dan had to agree. The size and equipment of the patrol suggested they were part of a larger operation, possibly a coordinated sweep to capture the remaining free Apache bands in the region. This knowledge added urgency to their mission while making it infinitely more dangerous. As they pressed deeper into the mountains, Takoda began to recognize landmarks that filled him with both hope and anxiety. They were entering territory where his people had lived for generations, but it was also country that would be heavily watched by military forces. Every ridge could hide an enemy. Every canyon could become a trap. On their fifth day, as they sheltered in a cave during the scorching midday heat, Takoda suddenly went rigid with alertness. "Horses," he whispered, his keen hearing picking up sounds that Dan couldn't yet detect. Many horses, coming fast. Dan moved to the cave mouth and peered carefully through the concealing rocks. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the passage of at least 20 riders moving at a steady lope through the canyon below. As they drew closer, Dan could make out the details that identified them as Apache warriors rather than cavalry. The distinctive way they sat their horses, the traditional weapons mixed with captured rifles, the paint and feathers that marked them as members of a war party. Takoda's excitement was barely contained as he studied the approaching riders. "My uncle," he suddenly exclaimed, pointing to a figure near the head of the group. "Ayana's father. They live." The reunion that followed was emotional and dramatic. Takoda burst from the cave and ran down the slope, calling out in Apache to the surprised warriors. The lead rider, a man named Nasha, who was indeed Takoda's uncle, leaped from his horse and swept the boy into an embrace that spoke of grief, transformed into joy. Dan emerged more cautiously from their hiding place, his hands visible and non-threatening but ready to defend himself if necessary. The Apache warriors studied him with obvious suspicion and curiosity, trying to understand why a white man was traveling with their lost clan member. Takoda spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Dan and obviously explaining the circumstances of his rescue. Dan caught enough words to understand that the boy was describing how the white man had saved his life by sharing his last water, had hunted for food when they were starving, and had risked his life to help search for Takoda's family. Nastya approached Dan with the dignity and caution of a leader trying to assess a potentially dangerous situation. "Boy says you saved his life," he said in careful English. "Says you gave your water when you were dying of thirst yourself. This true?" "The boy was dying when I found him," Dan replied simply. "Couldn't just leave him there." "Why?" Nastya pressed. "Why risk your life for Apache child? Your people and my people are enemies." Dan considered the question seriously before answering. "Maybe because a child is just a child, regardless of who his people are. Maybe because I've lost everything too, and I know what it feels like to be alone and desperate." The Apache war party made camp in a hidden canyon that provided water, grazing for their horses, and natural fortifications against surprise attack. Dan found himself accepted into their circle with a mixture of curiosity and respect, though he remained acutely aware that his position was precarious. These were warriors who'd been fighting for their survival against overwhelming odds, and trust didn't come easily to people who'd learned that betrayal could mean death for their entire band. Nastya proved to be not only Takoda's uncle but also the war chief of this particular group, survivors from several scattered bands who'd come together under his leadership to continue their resistance against forced relocation to the reservations. Dan estimated there were about 40 people in the camp, including women, children, and elderly members who required protection and care. As evening fell and the warriors gathered around their carefully concealed fires, Dan learned more about the desperate situation facing these last free Apache. Their numbers had been decimated by continuous warfare. Their traditional hunting grounds were occupied by settlers or soldiers, and their sources of food and supplies had been systematically eliminated by government forces determined to starve them into submission. "We cannot fight much longer," Nasha admitted during a private conversation as they sat watching Takoda play with other children around the camp. "Too few warriors, too many soldiers, but we cannot surrender either. Reservation is slow death for our people." Dan understood the impossible position these people faced. He'd seen enough of frontier politics to know that surrender would indeed mean cultural death, the destruction of everything that made them Apache in favor of forced assimilation into white society. Yet continued resistance seemed equally hopeless against the overwhelming military superiority of the United States Army. What if there was another way? Dan asked carefully. Something between surrender and endless war? Nasha studied him with intelligent eyes that held depths of sorrow and wisdom earned through years of impossible choices. What other way exists for Apache? We are hunted like animals, killed for wanting to remain free in our own land. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of scouts bringing urgent news. A large cavalry force was moving through the area, conducting a systematic search of every possible hiding place in the mountains. The scouts estimated at least 200 soldiers with Apache trackers from the reservations, supported by supply wagons and artillery that could reduce any defensive position to rubble. The war council that convened immediately was tense and desperate. Some warriors argued for immediate flight deeper into the mountains. Others favored splitting up into smaller groups that would be harder to track. A few of the younger men wanted to attack the cavalry force before it could surround them, preferring death in battle to capture and imprisonment. Dan listened to the debate with growing understanding of just how desperate their situation had become. These people weren't savage raiders or bloodthirsty killers, they were families trying to preserve their way of life against impossible odds. The children playing in the camp reminded him of any frontier community. Innocent lives caught up in conflicts they hadn't created and couldn't control. As the arguments continued, Dan found himself thinking about his own situation. He'd originally intended to help Takoda find his family, and then continue on his own journey, probably toward California where a man could disappear and start over. But watching these people face extinction, he felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since losing his ranch, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. "I might have an idea," Dan said quietly, causing the entire council to turn toward him with surprise. "It's risky, and it would require trusting me completely, but it might give you a chance to escape without anyone getting killed." Dan's plan was audacious in its simplicity, and terrifying in its reliance on his ability to deceive experienced cavalry officers. He would present himself to the approaching military force as a prospector who'd been working claims in the mountains, armed with just enough geological knowledge to make his story credible. While the soldiers questioned him and searched the immediate area based on his misleading information, the Apache would have time to escape through hidden trails that led deeper into the mountains. "You would risk your life for people you barely know?" Nasha asked, his weathered face showing a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "If soldiers discover you lie, they will shoot you as Apache sympathizer." "Maybe," Dan agreed. "But if I don't try, those children are going to die or spend their lives in prison. That's not something I can live with." The war chief studied Dan for a long moment, then spoke briefly to his warriors in Apache. The discussion that followed was intense but brief. These people had learned to make life and death decisions quickly when survival depended on speed and courage. "We accept your help," Nasha announced finally. "But know this, if you betray us, we will hunt you to the ends of the earth. If you prove true, the Apache Nation will owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Dan spent the next hour memorizing the details of his cover story and studying maps of the local geology that Nasha sketched in the dirt. The plan required him to intercept the cavalry column at a specific location where his supposed mining camp would be believable, then gradually lead them away from the Apache escape route while appearing to cooperate fully with their search. As the war party prepared to break camp and begin their dangerous flight to safety, Takoda approached Dan with tears streaming down his young face. "You not come with us?" the boy asked in broken English. "This is where we say goodbye, partner," Dan replied, kneeling to meet the child's eyes. "Your people need to travel fast and quiet, and I'd just slow them down. Besides, someone needs to keep those soldiers busy while you get away." Takoda threw his arms around Dan's neck in a fierce embrace that spoke of gratitude and affection that transcended cultural boundaries. I never forget, the boy whispered. Never forget white man who saved Takoda's life. The next morning Dan rode down from the mountains on a horse provided by the Apache, his appearance carefully arranged to suggest a prospector returning from a successful claim. He'd rubbed dirt into his clothes, acquired the tools and samples that would support his story, and practiced the slightly greedy enthusiasm that characterized men who'd struck it rich in the wilderness. The cavalry column was exactly where the Apache scouts had predicted, following a well-traveled trail through a canyon that offered several possible routes deeper into the mountains. Dan intercepted them at a narrow point where the officer in charge would be forced to stop and question any civilian encountered in such remote country. Colonel James Morrison proved to be a career soldier with the tired eyes of a man who'd spent too many years fighting wars that seemed to have no clear victory conditions. He questioned Dan with professional thoroughness, but accepted the prospector's story without serious suspicion, partly because it was well-crafted, but mostly because civilian miners were common enough in these mountains to be unremarkable. "Seen any Indian sign up there?" Morrison asked, studying the hand-drawn map Dan had provided of his supposed mining area. "Matter of fact, I did," Dan replied with just the right mixture of nervous excitement and civic duty. "Spotted smoke from what looked like a camp about 10 miles east of my claim. Thought it might be worth checking out." The misdirection worked perfectly, sending the cavalry column charging off toward a non-existent Apache camp while the real refugees escaped through hidden trails on the opposite side of the mountain range. Dan accompanied the soldiers as a guide, leading them on a circuitous route that consumed 3 precious days while Nasha's people put maximum distance between themselves and their pursuers. When the cavalry finally reached the area where Dan claimed to have seen smoke, they found only the cold remains of an ancient campsite that had been abandoned for years. Colonel Morrison's suspicion was immediate and intense, but Dan's story held up under questioning. He'd simply mistaken old ashes for recent smoke, an understandable error for a civilian unfamiliar with Apache camping practices. "Disappointing," Morrison said grimly as his scouts confirmed the site was long abandoned. "We had reliable intelligence that hostiles were operating in this area. Sorry I couldn't be more help, Colonel," Dan replied with apparent sincerity. "These mountains all look the same to me. Easy to get turned around." The colonel studied Dan with calculating eyes, clearly weighing whether the prospector was genuinely mistaken or deliberately misleading. "Mr. McCready, I'm going to give you some advice. These mountains are dangerous for civilians right now. I'd recommend you pack up your mining operation and head back to civilization until we've cleared out the hostile Indians." "Appreciate the advice, Colonel," Dan said, "but I've got a good claim up there, and I can't afford to abandon it. I'll be careful, keep my eyes open." Morrison nodded reluctantly and ordered his column to continue their sweep of the area, though Dan could see the frustration in the officer's bearing. 3 days of hard marching had produced nothing but cold trails and false leads, while the Apache they were hunting had seemingly vanished into the vast wilderness of the southwestern mountains. Dan waited until the cavalry was completely out of sight before beginning his own journey toward whatever future awaited him. His involvement in the Apache escape had burned any possibility of settling peacefully in this territory. If Morrison ever discovered the truth about his misdirection, Dan would be hunted as a criminal and traitor. California still beckoned as a place where a man could disappear and start over, but the journey would be long and dangerous for someone traveling alone with limited resources. He'd ridden perhaps 10 miles toward the southern passes when movement on a distant ridge caught his attention. Through his field glasses, Dan could make out horsemen positioned against the skyline Apache warriors who'd been watching his movements since he'd left the cavalry column. As he watched, one of the riders separated from the group and began descending toward the trail, approaching with the measured pace of someone bearing important news. The warrior proved to be Joaquin, Nasha's second in command and one of the most respected fighters in the band. He rode up to Dan with obvious relief and gratitude written on his weathered face. "The people are safe," Joaquin announced without preamble. "Your trick worked perfectly. Soldiers went wrong direction, never came close to our escape route." "Glad to hear it," Dan replied, though he noticed that Joaquin seemed to have more to say. "Takoda and the others make it through the passes all right." "Boy speaks of nothing but brave white man who saved his life," Joaquin said with what might have been amusement. "Makes you sound 10 feet tall and bulletproof." "Kids tend to exaggerate," Dan observed. "I just did what anyone decent would do." "No," Joaquin corrected seriously. "You did what Apache warrior would do, risk your life to protect people who could not protect themselves. This creates obligations, bonds that must be honored." What Joaquin revealed next transformed Dan's understanding of his situation and his future prospects in ways he could never have imagined. Nasha and the tribal council had spent the past 3 days in intense discussion about how to properly honor the debt they owed to the white man who'd saved not just Takoda's life, but potentially the lives of their entire band. Among our people, Joaquin explained, when someone risks their life to save others, they become family, not just friend, not just ally family. This means we have obligations to you, just as you now have ties to us. Dan felt uncomfortable with the formal weight of what was being described. I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't need anything in return. Helping Takoda was its own reward. You do not understand, Joaquin continued patiently. This is not about what you need or want. This is about honor, about the proper way to live in the world. You gave everything you had to save Apache child. Now Apache must give something back, or we lose our honor. The warrior gestured toward the ridge where the other horsemen waited, and Dan realized for the first time that they were leading a string of horses, magnificent animals that showed the careful breeding and training that made Apache mounts legendary throughout the Southwest. Nasha sends you 20 horses, Joaquin announced. Best animals in our herd, including 2 of his own personal mounts. With these, you can start new life anywhere you choose. Sell them, breed them, use them to build ranch again, whatever you need. Dan stared at the approaching horse herd in amazement. 20 prime horses represented enormous wealth on the frontier, enough to establish a substantial ranching operation or provide financial security for years. But more than their monetary value, these animals represented acceptance and trust from people who'd learned to be suspicious of all outsiders. There's more, Joaquin continued. Nasha says you are under protection of our band now. Anyone who threatens you threatens us. Any Apache who meets you will know you are family, will help you if you need help. The implications were staggering. In a territory where Apache raids were still feared and hated, being under their protection would make Dan safer than any sheriff's badge or military escort. More importantly, it meant he'd never truly be alone again. He was connected now to a people who valued loyalty and courage above all else. I don't know what to say, Dan admitted, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. This is far more than I deserve. You do not decide what you deserve, Joaquin replied with Apache directness. You risked your life for our children. We give you horses and protection because honor demands it. To refuse would insult us. As the string of horses approached, Dan could see the quality of the animals Nasha had chosen for him. These weren't just any horses, they were the finest examples of Apache breeding skill. Animals that combined speed, endurance, and intelligence in ways that made them worth their weight in gold to anyone who understood horseflesh. The lead mare was a magnificent paint, with the alert eyes and perfect conformation that marked her as exceptional, even among this outstanding group. Behind her came geldings and mares of various colors and bloodlines, each chosen for specific qualities that would make them valuable for breeding, riding, or trading. The paint mare, Joaquin said, noting Dan's admiration, is called Ayana, means eternal blossom. She was Nasha's warhorse, carried him through 20 battles without taking a wound. He gives her to you as symbol of trust. Dan approached the mare slowly, extending his hand for her to scent before gently stroking her neck. Ayana responded with the intelligent alertness of a horse that had been treated as a partner rather than mere property, and Dan could feel the strength and spirit that had made her legendary among the Apache warriors. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Dan had ever experienced, transforming what had begun as a simple exchange of gifts into a formal adoption that bound him to the Apache people through ties of honor and mutual obligation. Joaquin produced a traditional war shirt decorated with symbols that told the story of Dan's rescue of Takoda and his role in saving the band from cavalry pursuit. You wear this, Joaquin explained, helping Dan don the ceremonial garment, and any Apache will know you are family. They will share food, water, shelter. They will fight beside you if you are threatened. They will treat your enemies as their enemies. Dan felt the weight of history and responsibility settling around his shoulders, along with the beautifully crafted shirt. He was being offered something that went far beyond material rewards. He was being given a place in a culture that most white men knew only as adversaries, acceptance into a brotherhood that valued courage and loyalty above all else. What does this mean for my future? Dan asked, trying to understand the full implications of his new status. Where do I go from here? Wherever you choose, Joaquin replied. But know that you always have home among Apache people. When you are old, when you need family, when world seems cold and empty, you come to us. We will care for you as we care for our own." The formality of the ceremony was broken by a joyful interruption, as Takoda appeared from among the waiting riders, having insisted on being present for this moment despite the danger of remaining so close to areas where cavalry patrols might appear. The boy threw himself into Dan's arms with unrestrained happiness. "You stay with us now?" Takoda asked hopefully. "Be Apache warrior, live free in mountains?" Dan knelt to meet the boy's eyes, feeling the pull of a life that would be dangerous but meaningful, surrounded by people who'd proven their loyalty and courage. "I'll always be part of your family now," he said gently. "But I need to build my own life too, find my own place in the world." Takoda nodded with surprising maturity, understanding concepts of duty and independence that were central to Apache culture. "You go, but you come back. Visit family, tell stories of adventures." "I promise," Dan said, and meant it completely. "I'll never forget you or your people." As the sun began to set over the rugged landscape, Joaquin prepared to rejoin the band, but not before delivering one final message from Nasha. "War Chief says to tell you that door is always open. Apache people are your people now. When you are ready to come home, we will be waiting." Dan watched the warriors disappear into the gathering dusk, taking with them his connection to a world he'd never imagined entering. But he wasn't alone. Around him grazed 20 magnificent horses that represented not just wealth but acceptance, not just animals but living symbols of trust and respect earned through courage and compassion. The paint mare Ayana approached him as he prepared to make camp for the night, nuzzling his shoulder with the affection of a horse that had chosen her human as much as been given to him. Dan stroked her neck and whispered promises of adventures they'd share, places they'd see together, and the new life they'd build with the gifts he'd received from people who understood the true value of honor. With his string of Apache horses and the protective blessing of Nasha's band, Dan's fortunes transformed almost overnight from desperate poverty to genuine prosperity. The 20 animals represented the foundation for a ranching operation that could compete with any in the territory, but more importantly, they carried with them a reputation that opened doors throughout the Southwest. Word of the white man who'd earned Apache horses through acts of courage spread rapidly through the frontier communities, creating a legend that grew with each telling. Some stories painted Dan as a gunfighter who'd single-handedly defeated Apache warriors in combat. Others as a peace negotiator who'd convinced hostile bands to surrender. The truth was both simpler and more extraordinary. He'd shared his last water with a dying child and risked his life to help that child's people escape to safety. Dan settled in the valley near Santa Fe, using his horses to establish a breeding operation that quickly gained recognition for producing animals of exceptional quality and temperament. The Apache bloodlines, carefully developed over generations for intelligence and endurance, proved irresistible to buyers who understood horseflesh. Within 2 years, Dan had built a substantial ranch and gained a reputation as one of the finest horsemen in the territory. But the material success was less important than the invisible protection that surrounded him wherever he traveled. Apache warriors would appear seemingly from nowhere when he faced danger, standing silently at his back during confrontations with hostile settlers or crooked officials. His enemies learned that threatening Dan McCready meant facing retaliation from some of the most skilled fighters in the Southwest, while his friends discovered that his Apache connections provided access to information and safe passage through country that others found impassable. The protection proved its value during the winter of 1887, when a gang of rustlers decided that Dan's horse herd represented an irresistible target. Led by a notorious outlaw named Black Pete Morrison, the gang planned a night raid that would have netted them enough valuable horses to retire in luxury south of the border. The attack never materialized. On the evening before the planned raid, Morrison and his men found their camp surrounded by Apache warriors who emerged from the darkness like spirits given physical form. No shots were fired, no threats were made. The rustlers simply woke to discover painted faces, watching them from every direction, with weapons that could have killed them all before they could reach their guns. "Dan McCready is under our protection," a voice announced from the darkness. "Any who harm him or his property answer to us. Leave this country and never return." The rustlers departed before dawn, and were never seen in the territory again. Dan learned of the incident only when Joaquin appeared at his ranch the next morning, sharing coffee and conversation as if protecting his adopted brother's livestock was simply part of his regular routine. "How did you know about the rustlers?" Dan asked. "We watch," Joaquin replied with Apache brevity. "Always watch. Family is family." As the years passed, Dan's ranch became a neutral ground where Apache and white settlers could meet safely, conducting trade and negotiations that benefited both communities. His unique position as a white man trusted by the Apache made him valuable as an intermediary, helping to prevent conflicts that could have escalated into bloody warfare. Takoda visited regularly, growing from the frightened child Dan had rescued into a confident young man who moved easily between Apache and white society. He served as translator and cultural guide, helping his adopted white brother understand the complexities of Apache politics while learning modern ranching techniques that he could share with his own people. "You remember when we shared last water in desert?" Takoda asked one evening as they watched horses graze in the valley below. He was 20 years old now, married to a woman from the Mescalero band, and expecting his first child. "I remember everything about that day," Dan replied. "Thought we were both going to die out there. But we didn't die," Takoda said with a smile. "We found new life instead. You gave me family, I gave you family. Both of us richer than any gold could make us." Dan nodded, understanding the profound truth in those words. His rescue of one starving Apache child had led to connections and prosperity beyond anything he could have imagined. But more importantly, it had given him purpose and belonging in a world that had seemed determined to break his spirit. Years later, when territorial officials compiled records of the most successful ranchers in New Mexico, Dan McCready's name appeared near the top of every list. His horse breeding operation supplied animals to the cavalry, wealthy ranchers, and private buyers throughout the Southwest. But the bureaucrats who wrote those reports never understood the real source of his success, the invisible network of protection and support that came from honoring the simple principle that a child's life was worth more than one's own survival. The Apache Wars officially ended, the reservations became permanent fixtures, and the wild frontier gradually gave way to organized territories and eventual statehood. Through all these changes, Dan's ranch remained a constant, a place where the old ways and new realities could coexist peacefully. His horses carried cavalry officers and Apache police with equal distinction, their bloodlines a living bridge between cultures that had once known only conflict. When Dan finally died at the age of 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren both white and Apache, his funeral became a gathering unlike any the territory had ever seen. Apache warriors rode from distant reservations to honor the white man who'd proven that kindness could triumph over hatred, while settlers who'd once feared his Indian connections came to pay their respects to a neighbor who'd shown them the possibility of peace. The horses he'd received from Nasha's band had multiplied into herds that grazed throughout the Southwest, their Apache bloodlines carrying forward the legacy of trust and mutual respect that had made their existence possible. And in the oral traditions of the Apache people, the story of Dan McCready and Takoda became a teaching tale about the power of compassion to create miracles in the harshest circumstances. The last entry in Dan's journal, found after his death, captured the essence of what he'd learned during his years in the desert. "I thought I was saving one boy's life, but he saved mine instead. In sharing my last water, I found a wellspring of belonging that never ran dry. The greatest treasures aren't found in the ground or earned through conquest. They're discovered in the simple act of caring for someone who needs help, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The legacy lived on in the children who grew up hearing the story, in the horses that carried their riders with the grace and intelligence bred into their bloodlines, and in the enduring proof that even in the violent chaos of the frontier, acts of simple human decency could create ripples of hope that lasted for generations.